My story started there, in a small town in Orissa. Went to a neighborhood school, took a little leap, did my engineering in my state, took the next big leap to do my MBA. This was out of my state, traveled out for the first time to do my MBA. Then took this big leap to the corporate world to become a brand manager, head of marketing. And then at the grand age of 32, I became an entrepreneur. Thought I was the king of the universe. But, well, it was not to be that way. 6 months later, I was there. Yeah, 6 months, things went horribly wrong, and I was right there. No money, no job, and no idea what I wanted to do the rest of my life. But that's not the story that I'm here to talk to you about, actually. That's a story that a million people have spoken. My story is about what happened next. When I sat down one day to say, what do I do with my life? Now, this is what happened. I had to get a job, so I had to write my resume. Now, how many of you here have tried to write a resume in the last few years? Raise your hands. Oh, wow. Now, how many of you have felt confused about what you want to write in your resume? Raise your hands. Yeah, same. Now, there I was. I was confused to an extent where it was debilitating. I was not just confused, so this is what happened when I started writing my resume. So what am I good at? What are my real achievements? What is my mission statement? Now, what am I genuinely passionate about? Because I had to write my resume, right? And I didn't want to lie to myself. I had to tell myself the truth. What does success mean for me? Now, it didn't stop there. It got worse with every hour that I spent with myself sitting there. What am I? Where am I going from here? What is all this about? What the hell is all this? You know, I was in that moment of, I would like to die. It was as bad as that. And then it kind of ended with this culmination of a question saying, who am I? What's my story? Really, I mean, started with a resume and then ended up with this existential question saying, who am I? What's my story? So I was frozen. I was really, really frozen. So Mark Twain said it, saying there are two most important days in your life, are the day you're born and the day you find out why. Actually, he was wrong. It is the day you're born and the day you ask yourself why. Because that's the day you start searching for your story. That's the day you start searching for your real resume. So psychology is a word for it, by the way. It's called Eugenic neurosis, existential frustration. Eugenic neurosis. So at the extreme end of it, people kill themselves. Actually, they do that. And I was borderline depressive at that stage, saying, oh my God, I mean, I'm suffering from this disease called resume-ness, or whatever that's called. So I had to write so who am I, what's my story? And there are two choices I had. I had to live or kill myself. But my son was on his way. My wife said she was pregnant. My son was on his way. So one of the options had to get deleted. So I had to live. Yeah. So if I had to live, I had to write my resume. Back to the same board, setting up my paper saying, how do I write my resume? Where do I go to find the answers as a question? So I went to the world of self-help. You know, 7 habits of highly effective people, 8 principles of success, 15 rules of happiness, 35 something. Complete disaster. I recommend you never go down that road. Complete disaster because it demotivates you because you see, oh, they did it, I can't. They got it right. You feel smaller and smaller. Every book I read, I shrunk a little bit. Every book I read, I felt they could do it, I couldn't. Then that was journey 1. Because I realized that you could improve only once you know what to improve, which is you have to become self-aware. You can answer the what once you can answer the how once you found the what. So what do I want to improve upon? I need to know myself better. So that was my second journey, to say I must figure out what my story is. So then I walked to the Himalayas. I said, I must find answers there probably. Self-aware. Someone said, if you go to Rishikesh, you'll find answers. So I walked up to Rishikesh. So Vedas, Vedantas, Upanishads, Bible, all kinds of stuff. That was good. It was not a disaster, but it was not a solution either because it didn't tell me how to write my resume. I wanted to write my resume, and that did not give me the answer to my resume. It gave me, the spaceship view of life. You're sitting in the spaceship and looking at life, saying, that's how life looks like. But the macroeconomic reality is very different from the microeconomic reality. My microeconomic reality was I needed to write my resume. So there I met a monk who changed my life. He said, well, you guys do data mining, right? So you're an analyst, so why don't you go and mine your inner data? And so he explained to me that you're actually an iceberg, and 90% of you is hidden to yourself. 90% of you is these layers, that there's a behavioral layer, which is where you operate from. Below that is the motivational layer, which is where all the psychological stuff is, where the id is, the ego is, the psyche is. Below that is the spiritual layer, where meaning lies. He explained to me that the surface meaning is all about thinking, reasoning, decision-making, attention. But the deeper meaning comes from emotional spaces of surprise, anger, happiness, fear, love, acceptance. So I went to do data mining. He said, you've got an inner net. While like there's an internet, there's an inner net. So you should walk there and discover your inner net. There's so much data lying there that you do not know about. So I had to become the subject of my own experiment. The only promise I had to make myself was that I have to be objective to my own data. So this is what I did. I did 3 kinds of data clusters about myself. First one was reflections from outside. I took a tape recorder like this, wrote down 22 questions about things like, when was I happiest, when was I saddest, if you could give me a job, what job would you give me, what do you associate me with? Interviewed 52 people. Ex-girlfriends, father, mother, teachers. I went to them and said, please, and I filled it down, transcribed it. Fantastic patterns. I started discovering things about myself. This was reflections from outside. Second thing I did was started observing myself. What movies do I watch? What books do I read? What kind of people do I meet? What kind of food do I like to eat? And there's data everywhere. So I started observing that I like to wear blue color. I like listening to country music. I like meeting people who are of a particular kind. And then I started realizing why I do that. So there were tendencies, there were behavior patterns underneath that. So I started observing myself. It's called ethnography. I did self-ethnography. And the last thing I did was the third data set, which is called creative play. This is based on Carl Jung's work on the psyche, where you have to find access to your psyche because the answer is real data. The real inner data lies in your psyche. So I had to trick my way into my psyche. So I would ask myself, I created a fun journal, and I used to ask myself ridiculous questions and give myself 2 minutes to answer, saying, if you could write your autobiography, what would be its title? Write down. So imagine how difficult that question is. If you could invite 3 people for dinner tonight from history to have dinner with you, who do you invite to your place? If you were stuck in a prison for the next 5 years and you can carry 5 objects with yourself, what objects would you carry to keep with you there? Now, if there was such a room called a happiness room, and if you could be there for a whole lifetime, what would that happiness room have? So I created a battery of 800 such questions. Every day I would wake up and I would write my answer to one such question. That became my creative play. But in that, I would start looking at my own psyche. Why am I writing this? Why is this answer coming? Where is it coming from? And then you start doing analysis. I had a huge data set about myself at the end of that journey. I knew about my beauty, fulfillment, anxiety, aspirations, my ambitions, my joy, comfort. In that massive data set, I started finding patterns. And then I did cluster analysis of that data set. I put it into 4 clusters. One cluster was myself, my values, my attitudes, my tendencies, my worldview. The second was my art. What do I like doing? What is my doodle all about? What is my skill? What's my poetry? The third place was what gives me joy? People, places, situations. What gives me joy? Then the last was, what do I want to do with my journeys, with my energies? What energizes me? What's my mission? Now, in that cluster analysis, I wrote a 180-page resume of myself. I had I had 180 maps of my life. My anxiety map, my happiness map, my aspiration map, my empathy, all of that, 180-page resume. I didn't just find my resume, I actually discovered a bit of my story. Oh, that's your story, really. If I held a compass, I now knew what was my north. Which way is really north? I was not looking at east, west, I could stare at my north. And in that, I found my ikigai. It's a beautiful word that I hold close to my heart. It's a Japanese word for what do you wake up to every morning? That's ikigai. And I found my ikigai in my cluster analysis, and I found my meaning. I know we keep searching for meaning, right? What is the meaning of meaning? This probably is that meaning that we search for. Now, talking about meaning, this is a man who inspired me in some ways to go down that road, Viktor Frankl. He was stuck in a concentration camp. He's a very famous, please read his book, Man's Search for Meaning. It'll change your life, I promise you. So he was in a concentration camp, and he would see the same torture to the inmates. This was in the Nazi camp in the Holocaust. Same torture, but different responses from people. So torture being the same, he said, how is it that different people are responding differently to that same stimulus? And then he discovered, and he said it's nothing to do with physical well-being. People who are stronger collapsed. People who are weaker stood up. And then he found in that people who survived the torture had their story in their mind. They lived up to that story. In the context of that story, the torture was manageable. Now, the thing is, we will all hit our concentration camp. We will all, at some point in our life, hit our concentration camp. It's a disease or a divorce or a loss of job. You will hit your concentration camp. But before that, you must find your story so that you can live through that torture. And that story probably lies in the inner net of yours, in the data that's there, stored inside 90% of you that you don't access. And so I encourage you to find your story before your next concentration camp moment. I wish you your story. Thank you. Thank you.